Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm speaking with our correspondent in Heidelberg, Germany, about the various corruption scandals that Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, is tangled up in. Thanks for joining me again, Shir.
Thanks for having me.
And is there really a chance here that Netanyahu will be forced to resign or will be impeached even?
Netanyahu continuously repeats that he's going to stay as prime minister for many more years. And he's intimidating his own party members and calling on them to stand up for him. And some of them have even started lashing out against those billionaires, trying to intimidate them so they don't cooperate with the police and don't give information in the interrogations. That is not working. The billionaires are speaking with the police. The police is gathering the information. And the state attorney, Mendelblit, is in an impossible position. He's a good friend of Netanyahu. He has pushed aside many accusations against Netanyahu over the years, but now against this amount of evidence, I don't think he can really push that aside for much longer. And the best indicator of what's going on is to look at Netanyahu's own party. And we see the ministers, we see the senior members of the party already starting to be a little bit uneasy in their seats, getting ready for a reshuffle. They know that if Netanyahu has to resign, there's going to be a very bitter struggle over who will be the next prime minister and who will get all the ministries and so on. And the fact that they're already starting to sharpen their knives tells us that they are ready to act.
And even if charges are pressed against him, is there any chance that he would resign? I mean, he's such a sturdy and adamant prime minister.
Well, if you remember during the debate between Clinton and Trump, Trump was asked whether he would respect the result of the election if he doesn't win. And he refused to make that commitment, and that caused a certain level of panic. Now we see something a bit similar in Israel, because if charges are pressed and Netanyahu refuses to resign, there is no law, there is no legal mechanism that forces him to resign. He has immunity as long as he's prime minister, so charges can be pressed, but they will be frozen and he cannot be taken to court or to jail while he reigns as prime minister. But in that case, because there is such an accepted norm that prime ministers cannot reign while there are charges pressed against them. By the way, it was Netanyahu himself who made that claim against the previous prime minister. He said the prime minister cannot function when there's a legal case against him. And this should be noted. This is especially relevant for Israel, not so much with the United States. Bill Clinton did continue to serve as president while defending himself in court. That has never been seen in Israel's history. If Netanyahu insists on following Bill Clinton's precedent and try not to resign, then his coalition might still collapse. And in that case, he will be immediately kicked out. So it's very likely that in order to avoid this humiliation, he will resign if charges are pressed against him. But in the unlikely case that he doesn't and that he manages to stay in power, Israel basically becomes a dictatorship.
Right. And Shir, Netanyahu has very strong ties to the United States, and that is seen in his favor. And if he were to resign or forced to resign, this connection that Netanyahu has, particularly with the Republicans, does that hurt Israel, and would that prevent sort of the charges being laid and investigations being carried out and him being forced into a corner here?
So I was actually expecting Netanyahu to use that as part of his defense, to say that he's such an important asset to Israel's foreign relations because of his good contact with the Republicans, with Donald Trump, because of Shadel Edelson, the biggest donor to Trump, who is a personal friend of Netanyahu, that Israel cannot afford to lose him. I think Netanyahu was right in not using that line of argument, because I think most of the Israelis understand there's very close relation between the Republican Party and between American billionaires and Israel and Netanyahu is actually a facade. It's not a personal friendship with Netanyahu. It's in the interest of the Republican politicians to have good ties with Israel, and it really doesn't matter who the prime minister of Israel will be. Israelis understand that, and they understand that Netanyahu has not been very successful actually in convincing the public opinion around the world to support Israel. He's made very serious blunders in his foreign policy, and I think what we also see, very interesting, is that Netanyahu was actually willing to throw his good friend Sheldon Adelson under the bus. In those conversations that he had with a publisher and chief editor of Yediot Achronot, an important newspaper in Israel, he said to that editor, I can get rid of Sheldon Adelson's newspaper for you, Israel Hayom, Israel Today. I can get rid of it for you so that your newspaper will sell better. And Adelson has already responded to those publications, and the number of copies that are freely distributed of his newspaper in Israel has declined by a third. So that seems to show that he's already taken offense.
Right. And then finally, how is all this transpiring in the Israeli media and among the general public?
So I read this morning with alarm and surprise that Transparency International, the global organization to measure corruption, has actually reported that Israel is now 2 places better on the corruption scale, meaning that corruption is on the decline in Israel. But then I realized that the way that Transparency International are conducting their research is by public perception. They ask people, how corrupt do you feel your government to be, not by actually using economic data. Most Israelis are fully aware that Netanyahu is corrupt. Most of them don't care so much. And Netanyahu continues to be a popular prime minister in Israel because he offers a kind of deal to the Israeli public, to be very populist, to promote domestic policies which are very aggressive, pro-Jewish, pro-Zionist, and anti-Palestinian. In exchange, the public basically allows him to do whatever he wants and to cut deals with billionaires that actually affect the standard of living of Israelis. And Netanyahu has also declared this week that 2,500 new houses will be built in the illegal colonies around Jerusalem in occupied West Bank. And the UN has already condemned that decision. But he's doing that precisely because of those accusations of corruption, because he needs to make a populist statement now to say, the people are still behind me, the public is behind me. It doesn't matter if he's destroying Israel's foreign relations as long as he gets to keep his seat.
All right, it's starting to sound very familiar, all of this. There's a lot of lessons to be learned in terms of the Trump presidency in the United States, which has some of the similar strokes. I thank you so much for joining us, Shir, and looking forward to having you back very soon.
Thank you very much, Arnie.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.